Right, so as we continue to look at the classical era and the empires of the classical era, today we're going to take a look at the Greek Empire. So why don't you go ahead and make a Cornell Notes template, and I'm going to apologize right now for my terrible handwriting. I don't have a very good stylus, so I did the best I could with the limited skills I have here. So our topic today, of course, is the Greek Empire, and we're eventually going to compare that with the Persian Empire, which we've already taken notes on. We'll also take a look at the Roman Empire and Chinese empires in the form of the Qin and the Han dynasties, and we'll kind of have a comparative look of all these empires by the end of this unit. But our ongoing essential question is, how are empires formed and maintained? How are they formed and how are they maintained? And that goes really to addressing our compelling question, which is what empowers empires? What allows them to form and to exist? I mean, forming the empire on some levels is maybe the easier part, or at least the easier part of the question to answer. It's maintenance of empire that's more difficult. So, okay, our Cornell Notes template here. And again, what I will do is ask you to stop the video so that you can write down the notes on the slide, and then you can add notes based on my oral commentary as I give like oral discussion of these notes. Also, if you have any questions, like we normally have during these discussions in class, feel free to jot your questions down in the left-hand margin. That's part of what that left-hand margin is used for. So feel free to do that as we go. Right, so the Greeks, they actually don't call themselves Greek. They don't refer to themselves as Greek. They actually call themselves the Hellenes. Let me write that down. Whoa, my bad. Let me try writing that down. Hellenes, the Hellenes. Or sometimes called the Hellas. Yeah, I like that better. Hellas. They consider themselves the Hellenes, and that keep that in the back of your mind, because when Alexander the Great forms his empire, his Greco-Macedonian empire, he will call it the Hellenistic Empire, because he considered it to be a Greek empire at any rate. The Greeks are located on the Peloponnesian Peninsula, and that is a mouthful to be sure. Peloponnesian is a word that we're going to see later. As we look at this quote-unquote empire, in reality, the Greeks weren't so much of a political empire as they were more of maybe an economic empire. They didn't seek to conquer the way that the Persians did, or other empires. Certainly Romans, the Han, the Qin, all were engaged in territorial conquest. I can't really call this the same type of empire. So one of these things is not like the others, and that's the Greeks. The Greeks really rise to prominence in the 5th century BC. And the 5th century BC is actually the 400s BC, because if you think about it, from 0 to 100 BC, that's the 1st century. So then the 100s to the 200s is like the 2nd century. So by the time you get all the way out to the 400s, that's actually the 5th century BC at any rate. So it's the 400s BC when the Greek city-states rise to prominence. And again, this is unusual because the Greeks are not a centralized government. They don't have a centralized government. They do have a common culture. They do have a common religion. They have a common language, but no common government. They have city-states that are all independent, and they all have a different form of governance, which you see here at the bottom of the slide, and it depended on what city-state you were in. Even within Athens, over time, things went from an aristocracy, which is ruled by the upper classes, or the aristocracy, if you will, to a tyranny, which is basically a dictatorship, only didn't have that negative connotation, to a direct democracy, which is what we kind of remember it as. But that didn't really come into being until the 5th century BC, until the 400s BC. You also have a monarchical form of government in Sparta, and you have a variety of different governments, depending on what city-state you were in. Thebes, for example, had something different. So The Greeks, however, rise to prominence in the 5th century BC as a result of the Persian Wars. So the Persian Wars occur basically because Athens was sticking their nose in where it didn't belong. They were supporting Greek city-states in the Ionian Peninsula. Ionian, yes, that is Turkey today. So there were Greek settlements all along the coastal edge of the Greek peninsula, or excuse me, the Turkish peninsula. And the Athenians were supporting those city-states in their resistance of Darius of the Persian Empire. And, you know, we talked a little bit before about the Persian Empire and defying Darius and how dangerous that could be. And it was indeed dangerous. So Darius declared war on Athens, and Athens then rallied the troops. They went to other Greek city-states, even though they weren't even really friends, and were able to ally them all together in a united effort against the Persian Empire and win a stunning victory, if I may say. I mean, Persia was like 10 times the size of Greece, or the Greek city-states, both in terms of just territorial size, but also in terms of population. I mean, the Persian Empire was between 35 and 50 million people in terms of population, and the Greeks were like maybe 3 million to 5 million, something like that. So it's on the order of 10, and the Greeks were able to win. And your textbook suggests that this loss for the Persians was not significant at all. It was barely a blip on the radar, but for the Greeks it was very significant. So that began sort of the rise of an economic Greek empire. We won't talk necessarily about a political Greek empire, because it's not in the same conversation as the rest of the empires. We'll examine this unit, but economically it kind of is. So this began the rise, or I should say the encounter of a golden era for Athens at the very least. This will unfortunately end with a series of civil wars toward the end of the 400s BC, known as the Peloponnesian Wars, which again, all the Greek city-states exist on the Peloponnesian Peninsula, and so the Peloponnesian Wars are a series of Greek civil wars. Right, so you may want to pause and go ahead and copy down this particular slide before then resuming the audio commentary and taking notes on, or adding to your notes on that as well. So what forms actually after the Persian Wars is something called the Delian League, and that's the title of this slide. The Delian League was headed by Athens. Athens emerged as the leader of the Greek city-states in some sense after the Persian Wars, because they were the ones that sort of rallied the troops, if you will, sensing the Persian invasion. They knew they could not survive without some sort of support and help. So they had gone to Sparta and Thebes and all the other city-states and rallied the troops against the Persians, and thus they emerged as the de facto leader of these Greek city-states. Now, that doesn't mean that they were the federal government, if you will, of Greece or a Greek empire. They weren't. In fact, all the Greek city-states maintained their own forms of government. And in fact, many of them resented Athens and their arrogance and their leadership and their wealth. And that's the thing is Athens was in charge of the Delian League, and the Delian League is really sort of like an economic empire. As you see in yellow on this particular slide here, that area is all the area that was part of the Delian League, and within that yellow highlighted area, you see a lot of different city-states that participated in this trade league. And so really the Greek Empire is not due to conquest, like as I mentioned before, the Persians. It's more due to the fact that Greeks migrated to various areas in these yellow areas, in these city-states in the yellow areas, and then mixed and mingled with the locals there, and sort of spread Greek culture and Greek ideas, and all this was held together by trade, and specifically it was held together, as you can see here, by the Athenian navy. The Athenian navy was very powerful and important. It was helpful in terms of winning the Persian Wars, but also in terms of preserving Athens, as the Persians actually invaded and burned Athens to the ground. People were evacuated onto boats and saved their population. And so Athens had been a trading state or a trading city for a long period of time, and they naturally took control, therefore, of this sort of trade league. In terms of maintenance of the empire, other than just, there is no significant infrastructure that's constructed, like we talked about with the Persian Empire, that they constructed roads and the importance of that in terms of moving troops and communications and trade. All this is done over the waters, over the waterways for the Athenians and for the Greeks. So there's no significant construction of infrastructure that takes place. The treatment of conquered peoples, well, foreigners traditionally are not considered citizens, even within Athens. If you weren't born in Athens, if you weren't a male whose parents were born in Athens, then you were not considered a citizen. So, although foreign peoples were respected for their abilities, certainly to produce goods, and they were traded with and that kind of thing, they were not considered equal with Greek citizens themselves, and they were not given the same political rights. Now, the decline of this economic empire is really due to civil wars that I alluded to before, and there's that word Peloponnesian. And so this is actually the Peloponnesian Peninsula. And all the Greek city-states actually exist on the Peloponnesian Peninsula. These are the Ionian, as I mentioned before. These were the city-states, Ionian, Ionian, the Ionian Greek city-states that were in rebellion against the Persian Empire, and these were the ones that sort of Athens supported in the rebellion against Darius, and that caused the Persian Wars. What causes the Peloponnesian Wars is basically jealousy and friction between Athens and Sparta. Athens and Sparta have never gotten along. They are completely different philosophically. They are completely different in terms of their political orientation. Athens is a direct democracy. Sparta is a monarchy, or actually a dual monarchy, and they just have completely different philosophies of life, not to mention government. And so ultimately, they go to war in a series of wars that really last about 25 or 26 years. The bottom line, the Spartans win, sort of. Really what ends up happening is that all the city-states of Greece are weakened so significantly that it allows them to be conquered by this guy, Philip of Macedon. Yeah, of Macedonia. And so Philip is just waiting out here, sort of in this nether region of Macedonia, waiting, looking, watching the Greeks destroy themselves, waiting for his opportunity, and he seizes it. And really in like 338 BC, he conquers most of the Greek city-states, although, be proud Spartans, not Sparta. But still, he does conquer those Greek city-states, and that brings an end of sort of this era of importance for the Greeks. Okay, so just take a minute to go back through the notes that you just took and circle, underline, and star any important concepts or key vocabulary words or key phrases, anything that you think might be on the test, and feel free to interact with your notes in the left-hand column.